William, you grew up, and correct me if I'm wrong with this. Your grandfather on your father's side was in the parliament for like 40 years or so, and
That's
your
right.
grandmother from your mother's side was the first barista in South Africa. So you are coming from a very, very politically active family in South Africa.
Yeah, that's the case.
And then your parents, Sydney and Fletcher, they were activists and lawyers, and your father was even involved in one of the Mandela cases. Was that inspiring for you?
And many of those, I mean, they left South Africa in the mid-1980s to go to Britain. So their leaving South Africa kind of corresponded with the period when I started as an artist. And I've often wondered, did my beginning as an artist have to do with them leaving? And so I felt I was like my own person in Johannesburg because they were in London. Or was it because it was the birth of my daughter the same year, the first child? But yes, their connection to the law and to what was happening in South Africa was certainly very seminal in growing up. And in the way I still work now, I'm sure.
One might think it could have also inspired you to become a politician or an activist or a lawyer. When did you think? Sorry?
Or to do the opposite, not in the sense of not to be a lawyer. I think there was such a kind of a legal thinking in the house that whatever opinion I had was going to get shot down in 3 seconds by a couple of questions of cross-examination, that it was important to find a way of making my own opinion or finding my own opinion that was independent of legal processes and legal reasoning. So all the deep logic of legal reasoning, I needed to find a way around that.
Yeah. So when was it that you thought, when did you know you wanted to be an artist, William?
I'd always been interested in drawing, and I'd done it as a child. I mean, all children draw. And the only thing was, I suppose, I forgot to stop. So when I was an adolescent, I was going to drawing lessons. And when I was at university studying politics and history, I still went to part-time evening drawing classes. And then in my last year at university, in fact, spent all my time at the art school and not at the university. So I had a short first period thinking I'd be an artist. Then I had 3 years where I decided I had no right to be an artist. Didn't have anything to say, so I tried various other things. I tried to be an actor, went to theater school. I tried to be a filmmaker, but I failed at all of them. I failed at acting, I failed at trying to write a film script. So I ended up I realized, back in the studio making drawings. So that was the second start of being an artist, which was when I was 30. So between 25 and 30, I was floating, not certain what I would be. Also remember, it was in South Africa, which was a period of great political turmoil. And I thought, only when South Africa transforms itself will I have a sense of what it is I need to do with my life, which was a very stupid way of thinking. But it meant I hadn't jumped at a profession. I hadn't become an architect or a lawyer or an engineer or an academic. And in a way, I was being an artist while waiting to discover what I would become, until at a certain point, a friend of mine said, you realize you're now nearly 30, you've never had a job, you are unemployable. No one will ever give you a job. So either survive or sink as making these drawings you're doing. And after that, I could say for the first time, I am an artist. Whereas before, I'd always didn't know what to write. On passport forms, I'd write down technician.
Yeah. I remember you told me once that you had art classes as a child early on, and I did some research. And so you had art classes every weekend until you were 14. And there was this great inspiration, Bill Ainsley, who you followed with live drawing. And then later, he did the Johannesburg Art Foundation.
Yes, that's right. So it was an interesting art school because it offered no diploma, no accreditation, not connected to a university. You could spend 1 year there or 10 years there, but you'd got no no piece of paper. You were only there because you were interested in it or what you could get from it. And I had some years there as part-time student in the evenings, and then a year and a half there as a full-time student, and then I became a teacher of etching in the school. It was a very simple school. I'd had a week summer course of etching. So I'd had 7 days of instruction how to do etching. And on the basis of that, I set myself up as a teacher of etching. So it was really inventing it and trying to learn it as I went.
That's incredible. Let's look at the first slide again. The first is you were 14 from 19.
I know it's an embarrassment to do such a bad drawing at 14, but the crude ink, the crude black and white ink, there's some of these black outline drawings which I suddenly realized are not so very different to what I'm doing now with rough paintings in Indian ink.
Yeah, and I do know that I actually really admire your early work, and I'm not the only person in the art who does. And there's even a catalog about your early works, right? Let's have a look to the next one. So here you have more.
Yes. That's like a real high school student drawing.
That was 1971. It's kind of you were.
Yeah, so I suppose about 16.
And then let's go for the next, and then the next, because this one is a self-portrait from 75.
Yeah. So this is you can see the one before that. At that stage, remember in the 1970s in Johannesburg, which was sort of at the very edges of any art world, there was a sense that to be an artist was to paint with oil paint on canvas. And so my unhappy years of trying to be a painter were with oil paint on canvas, and that mess is one of those examples. And then at a certain point when I started just working with drawing and with printmaking, in which it's legitimate to not work with color, to not work with oil paint, it was then, I suppose, that the gates opened. It was possible to really start thinking in the material. Before, all the time I was painting, I was thinking, does this look nice? Does this look nice? So this was a university piece, which is a poster for a play that I was an actor and deviser of, one of the team of a group of student actors called Junction Avenue Theatre Company. And this was a play about what was the position of a white middle-class kid in the light of the political situation in South Africa.
If we go...
So sometimes we had the picture of Karl Marx on the poster. On some of the other posters, there was Cecil Rhodes and Jan van Riebeck, an early colonist of South Africa. And these were very simple silkscreen posters, which we did in my bedroom.
If we move one back to the portrait, so one slide back to the portrait, 75. So it was so interesting when you said you wanted to be a painter, but then you removed the paint. And if we go back to the poster, of course, posters are also a way how to multiply. Like you said, you were printmaking. So printing is a way how to multiply and make leaflets and posters and be a messenger. And I think I always think that you being on message is very important. That was also a time in the mid-70s where you were starting with the theater company, and you were acting, and you were... Can you tell us a little bit more about the Junction Avenue Theatre?
Yes, Junction Avenue Theatre, at that stage, remember, this is the height of apartheid. 1976 in South Africa was like 1968 in France or in the United States. It was a year of big political turmoil. It was the Soweto uprising. There were many, many African school children that were shot by the police. And this is why we were making this play. And we had this question, do we go on making this play, which is going to be seen by, essentially white audiences at the university? What is our relationship to the huge political turmoil outside of the university in Soweto? And the decision was made to go on making the play, to say, even in the face of political crisis, it doesn't mean that work that happens either in a studio or in a theater loses its importance. In some ways, it gains an importance. And I suppose that was an early kind of grounding of a basic statement about what it is to be an artist in a situation of political emergency.
For me, when I first visited you in Johannesburg and you're talking about this, the theater time, talked about you wanted to be an actor, you wanted to be a director, you wanted to be an activist, and all of these things. And earlier, like 5 minutes ago, you said, oh, I had to rethink all of this. And when I look at your work now holistically, of course, you're all of the above. You are the actor in your work. You are
It ended up that way. I mean, I was fortunate that I had a year. I mean, I'd had a lot of acting experience at university and after university, which is why I thought I should become an actor. And I had a good year's grounding in theater school in Paris. So when I came back to theater as a director many years later, it was with some confidence of knowing the terrain and having an approach towards working in theater. And also, in fact, when I came back to film, having starting making animated films, I'd had a period after theater school working in the film industry as a set designer, as a kind of general dog's body in the film industry. So again, I'd had some sense of it. And then I first thought it was a good idea to do one thing only, to say, if you're going to do drawing, only do drawing. If you're going to paint, just paint. If you want to act, only act. And I thought, okay, that's be a master of something, but not a jack of all trades. And it was by default, I suddenly discovered 8 years later, in fact, I was doing all the different things and behaving the way I said I shouldn't, and only then understood that, in fact, the theater was vital for the drawing, and the drawing was vital for the filmmaking, and that all the different mediums needed to feed off each other. And a lot of the artworks that were made, and are still made, a lot of the drawings and other things, I would call them applied drawings. They're made in the service of some other project. A drawing is made because it's demanded by this piece of theater or a piece of film. And very often the drawings that come from that demand go in places I would never have gone if I was simply thinking of drawings as drawings.
Yeah. 1980 and 1990, there was basically the cultural boycott of South Africa.
Yeah.
In UNN, you went to Paris, you went to Europe, you came back. And perhaps I would like to jump a little bit to 1989. We have the first of the formerly 9, now 11 drawings. We go to the first video, which is this one. And we watch this for the first, let's say, 1.5 minutes.
Sure.
And talk about it, that would be wonderful. So let's play it. $1989, that was such a change. The East and West Bloc system, the Cold War ended. What was 1989 in South Africa after you returned?
Well, I mean, as you're right to put the two things together. So 1990 was when Mandela was released from prison. And it was the start of the transformation when we knew that political parties would be unbanned and it was going to be the end of the apartheid system, even though that took another 4 years before the first democratic election. But there was a definite connection between the ending of the Cold War and the ending of apartheid, because the apartheid regime had been sustained by support from the United States, from Britain. Remember that Angola and Mozambique were under Soviet influence. They had Marxist and socialist governments. And so the CIA was strongly supporting the South African army fighting these groups. It was a kind of a proxy war, a proxy war of the Cold War. And when that ended, when the Soviet Union collapsed, then suddenly the need to support South Africa and the South African army in that way disappeared. And, you know, there had been negotiations beforehand, but there was a real connection between the ending of the Cold War, the reshifting of geopolitics, and the ending of apartheid in South Africa. In terms of the art world and my work and the film that you've just shown, as you said, in the 1980s, there was the cultural boycott of artists from South Africa, and it wasn't a complete boycott. There was a possibility for some work to be shown, and had some small exhibitions in Europe and in North America. But there was never an expectation that work made in South Africa would be part of an international art conversation. In that era, to really be taken seriously as an artist, you had to live in New York or maybe in Paris or London. But one of the things that did, because there was no expectation that one's work was going to be seen in the world, that one's going to be part of a global art conversation, there was not the tyranny of the art magazines, which existed and exists for art students in so many parts of the world. You think, oh my God, let me look what's happening in Art News and Art Forum and Frieze, and now I can understand this is what needs to be done. This is what's being shown in this museum. Because if I did that, it would have been impossible to have done this animation. Animation wasn't something shown in museums or galleries at that stage. But because South Africa was so isolated, even charcoal drawings, figurative charcoal drawings, it was not what was happening. It was possible to find my own language and world. I mean, by then I was 1990, I was 35. And so when the cultural boycott ended and curators came to South Africa because they were interested to see what this country was, my work already had kind of found its language, its way of working. And I was completely astonished when it was invited into the center, so to speak, either into biennales or into Documenta, or because it, you know, the first several of those exhibitions, I thought, what am I doing here? I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm delighted to be here, but I can't quite understand why. It doesn't look like the other work I see around me. Yeah. And that is a piece of good fortune. I think it's much harder for artists now to know what it is they are doing because there aren't those either restrictions or those pressures.
This is an incredible work we have on the screen here. An 11-piece work on paper. It's actually quite monumentally big because if you stood in front of it, you wouldn't even basically reach the...
Yes, it's about, I think it's about, that's 8 yards, 8.5 yards wide. So 24, 25 feet, something like that.
Yeah, it's such an incredible piece. I first saw
it. So that came out of the thing I was thinking, what does one do with the horizon line? What does one do with space in a picture, in the normal rectangular format of a picture? And I was thinking of processions in Goya. And then I was also thinking of things that are less formal. And this, in fact, is, I think, based on, or the idea came from an image which was of men fighting with chairs, which is a drawing in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And I think it's a design for engraving on a military shield, on a circular shield, which, you know, is interesting also as a kind of applied art, which didn't need to stick to the traditional format of a rectangle. And what this gave me was a sense that you couldn't see it all at once. In other words, to see the verticality, you'd have to turn and shift your head from one side to the other to read it. So even though I wasn't yet making films when this was done, this was made about a year before the first animated film, or around the same time, there's something cinematic in the succession of images, both in the kind of a narrative direction, it's all flowing in one direction, in the fragmentation into different pieces, and as you say, 11 sections of paper, which are almost like 11 frames of a film.
Yeah, the sequential perception of a narrative, the cinematic format of many things happening at the same time, that they're happening simultaneously, but they also happen like a parade, like a procession, one after the other, is very much a recurrent theme in your work. And I would like to show Felix in Exile, which is from '94, the year where apartheid was.
The year of our first election, the first democratic election.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of violence just before the election, and this film related to, a lot of the film related to that violence just before our election.
Let's perhaps watch the first 1.5 minutes of this. It's such an important.
Okay.
And then perhaps we talk about Felix and also the Johannesburg film we briefly looked into. What's that for you, starting point? For me, when I look at a comprehensive overview of an artist's work, I somehow think about that as a self-portrait in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to talk a bit about the 9 and now 11 drawings and the first? We saw Johannesburg and we saw Felix.
So when I started the series of films, it was really to do something that wasn't just a drawing. I'd done some exhibitions of drawings, and I thought I need to do something that is different from just these static drawings. And I started the films with a borrowed camera with no expectation, A, that they would ever be seen in a gallery or museum. In fact, the first time they were shown in a museum or in an exhibition, instead of being delighted, I was insulted. I thought, what are they doing showing a film in an art exhibition? A film goes to a film festival. You can't show a film on the gallery wall. That's ridiculous. I'll be the laughing stock. But I said, all right, if the curator really wants it, let me see what happens. And only afterwards did I say, oh, actually, yes, it's quite nice to have it in an exhibition. But it was not something I'd thought of. And certainly when the first film was made, there was no expectation that 30, how many years later, I'd still be working with the same characters, with the same people who arrived by chance in the first film, that the way of working, of successively erasing and redrawing that form of animation would be like the bedrock of something that I come back to every number of years, almost as a kind of grounding to remember what the basis of it all is. And so the most recent one was finished about 1.5 years now, by now 2 years ago. And it'll be a couple of years before the next one starts. But each time I come back to it, there's like a great pleasure. There was a long gap between two of them because I couldn't find the right charcoal. And then I found a young man who started making charcoal, and I get these fantastic boxes of really thick and beautiful charcoal. And that made the animation possible again to find the right material to draw with. But they're not specifically psychological about the psychology of the people in the film, which is but they're a kind of commedia dell'arte actors in different situations or circumstances, parts of Johannesburg that I want to look at. So by default, over the longue durée, over the 11 films, it's a kind of long-term self-portrait. And it's also the fact that I started off looking like one of the characters, and I've grown into the age and shape of Soho. Started as Felix, and now I'm afraid to draw Felix again would feel like a kind of false nostalgia for a youth that's passed. So I'm afraid I turn into Soho. One of the things about that then is that Soho becomes, it's very hard for him to do anything in the film. He's now much more a watcher of the world around him rather than an active protagonist. I wish that was not the case, but it's how it is at the moment.
Just as a small summary, the 9 drawings, now 11 drawings, there is Soho Eckstein and Mrs. Eckstein as main character, and then there is the often naked. I also always thought it was an artist. There's always the often
he
naked.
Was. It was very much my persona.
Felix Teitelbaum.
Yeah.
3 main characters. And if I remember correctly, Soho Eckstein basically buys half of the city, develops it, and exploits it.
Yeah.
And Felix Teitelbaum is the artist who dreams and runs around the world.
Yeah, it became too easy to be separate from the complicity and from the ambiguities of the position of Soho. So he feels much closer to me. But I have to keep on remembering that's not me who I am. I mean, he looks like me, and I base it on, I use myself as a reference for drawing Soho. And how does the body move when he's looking at something? What does that look like? But it is a kind of a self-portrait in the third person, which makes it much easier in a way. I would never do that. He's doing that. And in fact, in the series of films that I'm making now, the main way in which the arguments are advanced are in conversations with myself. So there are 2 of me visible, one sitting over here talking, and the one over here listening and a bit skeptical about what that one is saying. So the conversation happens between myself. So it's both a kind of a self-interrogation, but it's also a demonstration of the multiplicities we hold inside ourselves, I think.
When I visited you, I think the first time we drove around Johannesburg, and I saw these landscapes, former mining landscapes, and I understood that the landscape in the first one, Johannesburg, second greatest city after Paris. It's also a portrait of the city, but thinking about these were done 89, the year going towards kind of Nelson Mandela. Then 94, all of this. What did that mean at the time to do work like this? Was this a social commentary?
No, I think that what happened is that the visual art, as opposed to film or novels or television, was seen as so marginal that you really had to work very hard to have a piece of work censored. There was one artwork in which there was a painting of Christ wearing a Christmas hat, and that was deemed to be blasphemous and was banned. But apart from that, I can't really think of any artworks that were banned. All the films had to go through the Publications Control Board, through the censorship board, and I suppose when I was showing them in film festivals in South Africa, when they started being shown in galleries or museums, then they didn't go through that process anymore.
That's so interesting that they found it too marginal. Let's look at the...
Yeah, it was always seen. It was, the censorship was interesting. So, for example, there'd be certain plays that were banned for being performed in black townships, but the same play could be performed in a theater in the center of Johannesburg.
Mm. And then you did something here with a handspring puppet company, Faust in Africa. Was that more under scrutiny from the government, or was that just seen?
I can't imagine that. Generally what had to happen, there would be a complaint made, and then the Publications Control Board would come to look at it. But this reworking of Goethe's Faust Part 1 and Part 2 with puppets would certainly not have been a risky undertaking at all. When we did the piece about the Truth Commission, Ubu and the Truth Commission, which is also with texts of what had happened to people under the apartheid system, together with different kinds of puppets based on Alfred Jarry's Ubu and documentary evidence. By then it was the mid-1990s, and the censorship board had more or less been disbanded by then in the democratic dispensation. So there was never the same kind of totalizing control that there was, say, in the Eastern Bloc or in the Soviet Union. It was a different kind of control. The South African government wanted to be seen and tried to convince Britain and the United States that because there was this openness in newspapers, there was a lot of openness for newspaper reporting, that they were different from other totalitarian regimes. And they were different, but they were nonetheless, as oppressive, as repressive, and as politically repressive and exploitative.
Yeah. Ubu and the Truth and Reconciliation process was, of course, a highly political work, and it was also it was a healing process that needed to happen in the country. And I just singled out this one image here, Sleeper and Ubu. For how long was Ubu part of?
That's a drawing that came out. So this is a drawing that came out of a piece of theater which combined, as I said, Ubu and documentary evidence from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But in fact, the theater piece had come out of a series of etchings. So it went from etchings to theater, from theater to these quite large drawings. In fact, there's a version of this, an etching. This is the drawing, I think, because it's too large for the etching. But there's an etching of this figure, which is quite strange. It's a sort of a white odalisque, a male odalisque, that hangs in the Constitutional Court in Johannesburg, the Supreme Court of South Africa, which was kind of a surprise to me and a mortification for my daughter when she went on a school visit to the court, and somebody pointed out that, look, there's Isabella Kentridge's father lying naked. She does not thank me for that experience. And this was an etching done at more or less the same time, I think.
You megaphones are so important in your work. They are in your sculptural works, they are in your filmic works, they're in your drawings. What is it about the megaphone, William? So
I think there are different things. The first is that it has a reference to a kind of agitprop theater. One thinks of Soviet constructivism, one thinks of the Neue Sachlichkeit, a way of expanding a voice. That the great Rodchenko photo of Lily Brick with her hand like a megaphone. But they also had another origin. We all remember from our art history that Cézanne said that the whole natural world could be depicted using, I think, a sphere, a cylinder, and a cone. And so he was interested in taking the outside world and reducing it to these very formal geometric shapes. I was interested in putting these geometric shapes back to work. So if you take Cézanne's cone, that beautiful, simple geometric shape, and take it back out into the world, you have a megaphone. So it both had a kind of an echo back to, and if you put the world on its hind legs walking through the landscape, then you take his sphere and you set it back to work. So it had both of those elements in it, but there's also something fantastic about what it is to draw the inside of the megaphone and the outside and also, yeah, those are the main things. But you're right. In fact, a week or so ago, we had a megaphone that was, I think, 2 meters high, 2 yards high, for a different project.
William, I love it when you zoom out. Can we keep the camera like this?
Yeah, sure.
William, when you now, that's not in Parliament, Isabel is not going to be embarrassed by this, seeing your father.
Yeah.
When you have you and the megaphone, this human scale of the object, and if we go to the next sequence of slides, there's 3 slides. First, you looking through a stereoscope, which is a little instrument with 2 lenses.
Yeah.
You do it and you see something 3-dimensional, and then we go to the next.
Yeah.
And next image. So there's always a blue line in the middle. And perhaps we quickly watch the first minute of stereoscope and then we talk about the impossibility of that instrument. So perhaps the first like 1.5 minutes here. Stereoscope, about the impossibility of perception, William?
I think that there are different things. The one in the film Stereoscope, it was about, yes, an impossibility of either having a quiet life or a busy life. How does one make sense out of either retreating into the studio and having a very quiet life or engaging with the world where it becomes too much? And how does one, that was a question I was grappling with at the time. In terms of the stereoscope itself, I'm interested in as a machine that shows us about perception. It shows us that we take 2 completely flat images and that in our brain, we construct this illusion of depth. So it's something that we have to do. We're not simply receiving the world, we're having to construct the world. And when you look in the world, you're not aware of this process happening, which always happens all the time between the retina on your left and right eye, which receive flat images and which your brain then puts into depth. But when you look at a stereoscopic machine and you see the 2 flat photographs, you're so aware of what it is you're doing in your own head to make this happen. Oh, don't worry.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter.
The beginning.
So I think that's what the film was about. But it also, in looking at it now in this fragment, I'm very aware of again, it's dividing me into two, or the person into two. Someone sitting here and someone watching him there. But there's a which I meant to mention after the Felix in Exile, the film which you started off. It starts off with a very beautiful female voice singing. And it was a kind of a shock for me to hear it, because I haven't heard it for a few years. I haven't listened to that film. But it was sung by a South African singer, Sibongile Khumalo. And we just got news that, in fact, she died yesterday, a woman in her early 60s. It was a kind of a shock to hear that voice from the grave. So a tribute to Sibongile Khumalo, one of our great singers.
Nice to acknowledge this. That's sad news.
Yeah.
And one of the voices that you have collaborated with musicians, you have collaborated with filmmakers, and we talk about this a little later when we talk about your opera work. I feel that stereoscope, also in the beginning, you see the microscopes and you jump from the microscope to the telephones. And somehow tools and instruments are objects in service of something. The megaphone is the service, the telephone, the microscope, these tools and instruments. And you mentioned before that often your objects are in service of something, like throwing a shadow or making a move. Or for me, later, and perhaps we go to the next one, the next video we have. It's a short one. It's only couple of seconds, but I think it's very important work also.
Good.
The next three slides, we see portage. So 1 to 3. We see here as a fold out, next is a detail, and then even more a detail. And of course, when I say an object in service of a function, it's also, of course, about how you make stop motion and how you bring objects into motion in a way. Do you want to talk a bit about the shadow procession and the idea of procession?
Yes, so the first piece that we saw, Shadow Procession, was made out of jointed pieces of paper. So in other words, if I'd had a joint there, I could bend this and move them, and we'd see how these fragments, how the fragments move. And so each of those figures that we see on the screen now is made out of several pieces of paper, and then I would simply move them on the table to say, should they lean further forward, should they lean back? So even though these are static images, they are posed and they find their pose and even their elements the way one would with an animation. And the animation comes from a kind of puppetry, a way of being so aware of what is the meaning of a gesture in a body. You know, in a puppet or in a shadow thing, you're not relying on the acting of a face, which one normally thinks of with film acting or even theater acting, that so much of the meaning comes from the expression in the face. But if that's completely, you know, if that's neutral, then it only can be in an attitude or what you see in the body rather than in the face. So it comes out of that. So there's a close connection between the puppetry work, the torn paper and jointed paper that is stop frame animation, or which sometimes becomes like this, which might get transformed from a piece of paper into an actual three-dimensional object. So that shift between paper, material, performance is very fluid. I can't always say which is the end point. Is something's end point to be a performance, or is the performance the way of arriving at a series of images?
Is the procession a political work?
The procession is always a political work, but it's political also in the sense that it has an ambiguous ending. None of the processions that I've done have got a clear ending. There's some, it's a kind of in the refusal of time, it looks somewhat as if it's a procession into a black hole, which is towards death. But it's not as if there's a utopian end to the procession. So part of them are references to kind of the processions we see around the world, refugees moving from through different parts of Africa or moving from Syria to Europe. Those images that we've seen in the news in the last 8 years, but which have been present in Africa for much, much longer than that. So there is a politics there. There's also a kind of a reference and a polemic about Plato's cave and the myth of the shadows in Plato, which is kind of a founding myth of Western philosophy about enlightenment and bringing people into the light and how you need to get rid of the shadows to understand the world. And it's a kind of a resistance against that. So all of those things are present, but they really come after the event. The event is making the processions and the shadows.
Mm-hmm. Let's perhaps see the first 1.5 minutes of Tide Table, which is
sure
later. Oh, it's actually the same year. It's no, it's
yeah, that's fine.
Let's have a look. What an incredible piece, William.
The Tide Table was made around, I think, 2003 or so, yeah. Which was like the height of the AIDS epidemic in South Africa, when we had a government that didn't believe in antiretroviral drugs, and we had the highest incidence of HIV and AIDS anywhere in the world. And it's estimated that something like 300,000 people died unnecessarily because of the delay in rolling out of antiretrovirals. So that was one of the things in the air at the time. So the hospital scenes were a kind of reference to that. The cows that got thin are a reference to both Pharaoh's dream that Joseph interprets in the book of Exodus, but also to the idea of AIDS as a disease of slimming, of thin. It would be called the slim disease here. So the films also act as a kind of a diaristic notebook. These were the things in the air at the time when the films were being made. So the most recent film, City Deep, has to do with the informal mining that is now taking place in many parts of the Witwatersrand area around Johannesburg, because the formal mining has shrunk so much, and there are so many people out of work that there's this large growth of informal artisanal mining. It's a kind of a deindustrializing of the country, which for me is a kind of premonition of what's going to happen in a lot of places in the world.
High table to come back to this word. You talked about the AIDS pandemic. And the AIDS pandemic was very, very severe in South Africa. In South Africa, actually, the average life expectancy went down to a little bit over 50 years during these years. It was like not comparable to other countries, also due to mismanagement. And so such an important document. And I think you're working now since 31 years on the 11 drawings for projection. So it becomes a portrait, as you said, of you and shifting roles of your country and the situation in the world. I want to, in the interest of time, I want to go to the next slide, which is actually at MoCA. That's our piece. Thank you so much. We have it. It's an incredible piece, 7 fragments for George Millier. And if we go to the next slide as a detail, the invisible mending, it's also a piece of you being in the studio. Of course, it references Millier's and the journey to the moon, but it also puts you as a drawn self and a projected self interacting with your own portraits. And that is something we will talk a bit later when we talk about I'm not me, the horse is not mine. But I want to perhaps go to the next slide and the black box. This is a bridge to your opera work because we have seen some of your puppeteer work. And if we go, so this is more like a model of a theater.
It's a model of a theater, yes. It's a model of theater in which a mechanical automatons perform the piece. It's a kind of another version of the magic flute, but this looks specifically at the genocide in what is now Namibia, what was then German Southwest Africa in 1906. So it's part opera, but it's mechanical theater.
It's actually a work that is so beautiful when you enter the room, very, very seductive and beautiful. And then you sit down and then the message, which is so serious and political and so sad. There's one sequence I remember where it's just a list of the names of the people that died.
I mean, it's a list because during this genocide, the names of all German soldiers who died in the war, in the battles, are listed, and there are about 120 of them. But the 90,000 Herreros who died, there are no names of any of those who died. So this is kind of like a putative list to say, let us list and honor the people who are anonymous in this circumstance.
Yeah, such an important piece, William, such an important piece. So let's go to the next. And so this is one of your anamorphic pieces. If we go to we actually have a video of this, which shows and run this.
Okay.
Some anamorphic, these cylinder mirrors that you put, if we keep this as a still, these cylinder mirrors that go onto a rotating drawing in several instances. What inspired you to do that, William?
Two things. It's always a combination of seeing something and then having a suitable material. I was in Italy on a residency, and I went to Florence, and I saw the anatomical museum, which has got astonishing wax anatomical models. And one of the things they had at the side or another section were these, I guess, 17th century anamorphoses with polished mirrors, polished cylinders, and drawings or prints below them. And I went back from this trip in Florence to the residency, which was in Umbria, and found that during the day, during my absence, they'd been putting in heating pipes into the residence and into the studios of the residents. And there, lying in the corner of the room, was an offcut of a piece of highly polished stovepipe. And so just having seen it there, I was given the gift of a cylindrical mirror, a crude cylindrical mirror to work with. And then it was about it's about the unnaturalness of the drawing you have to do to get what appears to be a natural drawing in the distorting mirror.
Yeah.
So that was the pleasure which went on. And in fact, I was working on one a few days ago using another mirror.
It's fascinating how between the stereoscope and looking through the stereoscope here, having the anamorphic cylinder mirror. And if we go further, because we have, in this studio visit, we have the unique chance that you are really in your studio and we can have a live camera looking through the studio. So I'm now going a little faster through the slides, William. If you don't.
Okay, while you've got that here, I'll just bring this into the view, which is the structure that you see in the photograph there. So that's still here in the studio, this set of stairs.
This was, for me, the performance you did.
Yeah.
Was for me an absolute paradigm shift, because you are performing live as a performer, as William Kentridge, as an actor. You're performing live in front of your projected image performance. Yes. And that is in front of a drawing of you that you had made. So there is a drawing of you, a projection of you, and a live view simultaneously in the performance. This was such an important piece. You got the ICA award for best artwork for this. And
it was it was a shift, because that was the first time a friend of mine said, "Come on, let's do a live performance," and it turned into this sort of 40-minute performance, "I'm Not Me, the Horse Is Not Mine," which I haven't done now for many years. But since then, I've done a number of live performances, both in the form of kind of lectures, but also things broader than that, such as the Kurt Schwitter's Ursonata. And the earlier picture that you showed of the Méliès, the 7 fragments for Georges Méliès, was also a big shift, where one of the things I was looking at was, as the series of film does, what happens in the studio? What are the processes of working in the studio that show us things outside of the studio?
In 2005, you had your show at MoCA here in Los Angeles, and with the 7 fragments for Méliès. And it's basically, you are in your studio and we can see you in this collection work. We can see you performing, interacting with your own drawings. You're ripping your drawings off the wall, you're repairing it, you're mending it. And here, it was, of course, a luxury of having you live present in front of the layers of you. Such an important piece. And
I mean, it was a really hard piece to perform. Every time I did it, I would say to myself halfway through, note to myself, never ever do this again. This is not a good idea. But then I'd forget until I was at the same point in the text, the next performance.
Okay, I'm not making a pitch. Okay. So let's go to the next slide. This is between the Duchamp and the megaphone and the object. Let's go perhaps one more. And here we have the megaphone as a drawing for other faces. And we show a minute and a half from other faces. And then we go into now, so we can actually arrive in your studio in real.
Okay.
Let's show a minute from other faces. William, shall we talk more about other faces when we talk about City Deep? City Deep,
sure.
last video.
Sure.
That would be, because I think they're also related in a way as the in the 11th drawing. So go to the next slide, which is actually, we are going into your opera work, and this is a trailer of the work you did for the Metropolitan, for the nose. I have to play this. Did this come as a natural progression for you? Having
it came out of the work with the puppet company, where we'd always had a lot of music in the productions, and then an invitation to do a chamber opera, which we did with puppets, a version of the Monteverdi's Il Ritorno di Ulisse, which still gets performed, in fact, 22 years later. And from that, an invitation to work in traditional opera with the magic flute, with the nose, with Lulu, and with Wozzeck. Those are the larger scale operas. So in that sense, it wasn't a jump. It's also something I'd been very interested in as a child, in listening to opera. But it is obviously, it was the first time I did one, it was a huge jump into the machinery of what an opera house is, with a conductor and an orchestra and 16 musical staff and 30 people in the room watching me trying to pretend I knew what I was doing when I didn't have a clue. But I like to think of the opera work as this extraordinary gift that's given to me. You know, you can either think you're the director, you're hired for 6 weeks by the opera house, you do your job and you leave. I like to think that the opera house says to me, you're going to make this 3-hour drawing, and we're going to give you firstly a canvas that is 17 meters wide, 10 meters high. And not only that, we'll throw in a fantastic orchestra. We'll throw in 12 great singers for you to use. You can have the use of our costume department, of the carpentry shop. And all of these resources are there to make this drawing that exists in 4 dimensions, in space and moving through time. And in that sense, they're wonderful, long, rich projects to do.
It's kind of beautiful to see when you think about how you were wondering while you did your drawing classes, drawing, painting, etching, directing, and the hand puppet company and all of this, how this all comes together. They are such incredible works, and I was fortunate to be able to witness that one and others of yours. So perhaps we talk a bit more about the all-encompassing idea of music also. in your work? Because you said before, you said, oh, I listened to that drawing for I haven't listened to that drawing in quite a long time when you talked about the voice.
Yeah.
So music is something for you that is from the beginning incredibly important. Do you work with composers, or how do you listen to your work?
I do it in different ways. So I've worked a lot with Philip Miller as a composer, and he's did many of the the biggest projects we've done together, and I hope we keep on working. And other times I've worked with found music, but there's always a long time of listening to different pieces of music of very different genres, very different timbres, very different qualities, to see what the relationship is between what you're hearing and seeing. Because the music doesn't just give you an emotion to an image. It makes happy or sad music. It gives it a grammar. This is caused by that. This comes first, then that happens. But it also changes the way that you can see. There's certain sounds which make it possible to watch a piece of animation, and other sounds that make the animation so rough and jerky, you can't actually follow the movement. So I've been doing this now for 35 years, 30 years, working on this question since the Soho films began, and it still continues. It's still I'm working today on the series of films about the studio, and a lot of that is working with the editors, listening to different pieces of music, different pieces of sound that we've recorded, to see how that makes you see and understand.
And it's incredible, the scale change or the scale variety, I should say, because while you do the nose at the Metropolitan Opera, you do let's have a look at the next work, which is a very short little video piece, but the scale change to go from monumental to such a detailed, let's play it. We all remember when we had little flip books as kids and we did our own flip book animation. This is incredibly beautiful.
So these are flip books. These are obviously, they're thousands or hundreds of pages, so it has to be filmed. It wouldn't actually work as a physical flip book, though we also made some of those which have their own distinct pleasures. But this was the principle of a flip book, just a page, the number of flip book pages you'd have in a dictionary, 1,000 pages, not 40. But it is a different scale to the opera, because the one is seen in a huge opera house, the other is seen on a small screen or a small projection. But the size of the drawings is often not so different. It may be a small drawing that becomes a huge image in an opera house.
Yeah, and we saw Black Box, where you had the object for the opera. And this is a different size here. This was at UCCA in Beijing. Note model opera. Madame Mao, she did these 8 operas that were circulated all over the Cultural Revolution China between 66 and 76. And you were invited to a very large exhibition in Beijing. And do you want to say a bit about what inspired you to do these?
Well, I wanted to do something that had to do with it, to have some element in the exhibition that was related to doing an exhibition in China. And the height of the Cultural Revolution, in a way, was 1968, although it went on, as you say, till 76. And in 1968, I was 13. And I remember thinking when I was 13, I'd missed out on my life because I wasn't in Paris, and I wasn't in Berlin, and I wasn't in Berkeley, and that's where life was. Oh, to have been 5 years older, to be a student in the student movement, involved with that politics. And at the same time, you had as those student uprisings in North America and Europe, you had the the Cultural Revolution, initially led a lot by students and high school children in China, and very influenced by the experience of 100 years earlier, the Commune in Paris. So it was a piece that looks at all of those, the connection between China and Africa at the moment, which is very fraught, the Cultural Revolution, and what the politics of 1968 were for a boy in South Africa looking outwards. And it did. We had the services of, it was a collaboration with Dada Masilo, the dancer you can see in the slide there, fantastic South African dancer.
Yeah.
Who played with dancers that were either like ballet or much more rooted African dancers.
If we go to the next slide, this is a work that is basically 100 feet across. And some of us saw that together, I think last year in Basel. If we go to the next slide, so you see the scale, you see the megaphones, and we have a very short little video excerpt to give.
Sure.
When we go, if we go one slide back, to the, you see the IV holders, you see people on intravenous dripping systems.
Yeah.
I always thought that came out in 2015, that was about the refugee crisis. And then I realized that was also, 2015 was also Ebola.
Yeah. So those people are very much a reference to the images we saw of people in, what's now called PPE, personal protective equipment, leading other people. So it was the Ebola epidemic in Africa, and it was also the refugees going to Europe. There's a big European, migration of people towards Europe, and all of these things came into it. So it was a reference to the dance of death, to those processional drawings, medieval processional drawings. And it was also a kind of a funeral, but a celebratory funeral march.
Yeah. If we go to the next slide, jump over the video, the next. It's another scale change. This is a monumental work for the anniversary of Rome. You want to describe a little bit what?
Yeah, so this is the Triumphs and Laments, is a frieze on the banks of the Tiber River in Rome that stretches 600 yards. And the figures are about 30 foot high, each of the figures, and there are about 80 figures that make their way down. And they're washed into the wall. So the wall starts off black from pollution and bacterial growth. And then we simply washed around the stencil. So if I put my hand against the wall and sprayed around it, and removed my hand, it would be white all in the spaces around my hand, and the image of my hand would remain black. So that was the way of drawing it. But because the darkness on the wall comes from this mixture of pollution and bacterial growth, over the 7 years or 6 years since that piece was done, in fact, it's more or less faded away. So it was always going to be an ephemeral project, this large ephemeral project. And the photo you see here, in fact, is of a performance that was done at the launch of this wall. But now, I would have gone there last year if it had been possible to travel to Rome from South Africa to see the last gasp of it. But I think now it has disappeared and it's ready for somebody else to wash another set of images onto the wall.
It's incredible. It's so monumental and not eternal. So yeah. Ephemeral, beautiful. So we go to the next one. I put two smaller because I think just seeing the processions and seeing the object and the casting the shadow. We go to the next slide. Because when you said earlier that the objects are somehow fulfilling a service, this is a singer trio where actually, as an information, the loudspeakers are moving, the The sewing machines are moving, and there is a sound to it. You want to say a little bit about this piece?
Well, it's called Singer Trio, and it's different. If you put your ear next to each megaphone, you'll hear one person's voice. So together they make this ensemble, a barbershop trio kind of close harmony. So it's about a series of kinetic objects which are kind of useless objects that they can't fix your trousers if they're torn, but it also is the things that can be done. So in this case, Chris Waldo, who's helping me here with the filming today, is the person who's done the engineering to get the machinery to work, to get the horns to turn, and then somebody who works as a video editor did the programming of the computer to get the song and the movement to be coordinated. So it's a mixture of an idea I might have, but it's always shaped by the possibilities of what we can do and make in the studio.
So your sculptures are basically made in the studio, and you have a production team, because we look behind, and perhaps what we should do is we should show the last 2 slides and then we go into the studio.
Sure.
So I wanted to show one incredible self-portrait from last year that your studio was so kind to share with us.
Right.
Self-portrait from 2020. And also a video, the 11th drawing for projection. And we should show this in its entirety, and then we go live into your studio, yeah?
Okay, it's quite long, but we can do that.
Oh, your studio gave us a 3-minute clip. So we show
a 3-minute clip. Oh, okay, that's fine. Yeah.
Thank you, William.
Good.
Great. Thank you for sharing this, William. So now we are
Well,
in
thank you for putting it together.
and that is a piece. That is a piece that it's from 2020. But of course, I know how long you work on animations like.
Yes, it was finished then, but it was really made in 2019.
Hmm.
The drawing, the substantial part. So it wasn't a lockdown project. It was a pre-COVID piece.
And
it's about the informal sector, and it's about the decline of the Johannesburg Art Gallery. That's the museum that collapses, sort of the museum of my childhood, which is in a state of kind of terminal decline at the moment.
And you mentioned the mining that goes on everywhere. That is like a second wave of industrialization, but it's not official.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a second wave of industrialization. It's a second form of mining. So we have huge industrial mining where you can grab 50 tons of rock with one grab. That goes on. There's a lot of that mining. But there are maybe many tens of thousands, maybe 70,000 miners who now make their living with a hammer and a chisel and an enamel plate, trying to gather, 1 gram of gold out of what's been left from the gold mines at that time. And that sense of the informal and formal sector, that relationship is both very important in South Africa, and I suspect will be the shape of development in many parts of the world that are never going to get the kind of large-scale industrialization that Europe or North America has had.
Mm. What an incredible new piece. So now it's 11 drawings.
11.
Are you continuing with these works?
I mean, ask me that in 5 years, I suspect so. I mean, the technique stays the same, the parameters of it stay the same. They now get shot with a digital camera, the 11th one for the first time. The other 10 were all shot on celluloid, but that's just not possible in, there isn't the stock, there isn't in South Africa, all the laboratories to process it. So,
what are you working on right now, William?
Well, I'm working on a series of films about life in the studio called Studio Life. They'll be about 45 to 50 minutes long. Each of them will probably be 8 or 9 episodes, of which 5 are more or less filmed. And they look at the way in which the studio is a kind of an expansion of one's head. Instead of a thought traveling a few centimeters through one's head, it's the movement across and around the studio. And so it's not really showing you this is how a drawing is made, although you see that, but it's really about other questions. So one is about memory, one is about fate, one is about the self. I've just finished one about translation. There's another one about how we make sense of the world through looking, which is what but these are some of the objects in the studio here are for the episode on translation, which is called The Weight of Words. I'll just get up from here, in which instead of a word, you might have a series of heavy objects, these bronze objects. So they're arranged on shelves almost as if that's a printer's tray of texts. And then I'm also talking about translation of scale. So we go from something that's hand size, like that, or it would start, in fact, most probably as a kind of a cut-out piece of paper. And then this is a small glyph to something that's this medium size. It was just suddenly saw that, in fact, this which is really about calligraphic writing, but if you give it the right head, it can become a kind of a goat. But I don't know that the goat head is going to come into it. And then from this, we're shifting in scale. So the drawing on the wall over here was a kind of a test of the scale that we're going to be making. And then this is the beginning of the actual sculpture. So this is sort of a few days in. It'll first have a wooden armature, then it gets covered with plaster of Paris, and then the plaster gets reworked and carved, and then it will be cast in bronze. And it's one of a series of these large-scale objects like big, heavy words. So a coffee pot, a jug, an ampersand. And this doesn't have the same specific object meaning as opposed to a kind of a movement of the wrist. This is one of the drawings from an earlier episode of the episodic series, and this is, can I move this? Can you see this here?
Yes, it's, yes.
Okay, so this is again, one of the things that arrives in the studio. It's an old broken sousaphone from a brass band that doesn't work anymore. But we discovered, or should I say, Chris in the studio discovered.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Does it sit on a chair, or is a chair
It
part?
sits on a chair.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you can hear it. It's close to my microphone.
Yes, we can hear it. Thank you.
But if you put it in this, I don't know if you hear the difference between that and we put it in here.
Yes.
Sing it right once or twice. Oh, out of me, didn't I shake sugar?
So that's it's a kind of it's our studio hi-fi system. But in this episodic series, it becomes kind of the unconscious of the studio. So there are film sequences at night where there's a duet between the sousaphone and an old movie camera. Different things shift across the studio. So it's a mixture of, there are performances in the studio. So in the last, for this episode, we've had 9 different performers coming in, and a dancer, some singers, a trombone player. And this scale of sculpture would usually happen in the studio in town, which is larger, more industrial. But for this episodic series, I wanted a sense of everything in the studio in this quite contained space. So the sculpture like that will eventually, the wax gets polished and shaped, and this will eventually have a kind of a surface similar to that. And it started off as a series of kind of just elements, different elements which get drawn, cut out, as you can see with all the scraps here. So during the week, on Monday, there'll be about 5 people in here working on the wax, working on the wood, and then a cameraman filming the process for the film, for the episodic film. So there's been a lot of drawing. There's been a big body of work of drawings which aren't up because they've been in the previous episodes that have happened over the last year, and which will be shown at some point, I'm sure.
It's an incredible process you are sharing with us. It's incredible.
So it's, I'm trying to think. I don't think there's anything else in the. No, this, the studio changes every week, and as we do each episode, it changes considerably for the different themes that we're covering.
But that's incredible to see, William. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you so much.
Good, pleasure.
And I think we are all coming back.
Good.
To also talk to you. So after this production, so there will be objects, there will be the films, there will be sculptures, there will be drawings. It's basically a whole world that you are conceiving right now.
So there's yes, I'm not sure when the films will be seen when they're made and when we find someone who wants to show them, which ideally should be some kind of streaming system in the end, I guess. They're made as episodic pieces, but at the moment we're in the stage of making the first group of them and then hoping to find the right place for them to. I'm sure they'll also be seen in other contexts, but we'll see.
How many people do you have working in the studio during the pandemic right now, William?
Well, at the moment we've got 5 and 3 is 8, 9. There are about 9 or 10 of us, but some people work largely from home and just come in for meetings or once or twice a week.
Yeah.
There are 7 of us that have had COVID and so have either a greater or lesser degree of immunity. And then we split it between editors in a different building altogether and a different office for the people. So it's, but in this room, each time we're filming, there's obviously a few people in the room.
And while everybody is coming back, we should open it also to questions. It's
Sure.
also wonderful that we basically went into everybody watching mode, and we have the same number, nearly the same number of guests still there. That's so wonderful.
Gosh,
Thank you
that's
so much.
well. Thank you for the patience, everyone, to have stayed on so long.
William,
It was quite a journey you took everyone on, and me too.
William, a huge thank you to you. It's kind of incredible to be so generous with your thoughts and your insights.